I'm Yvonne Hamoud, registered social worker and owner of New Moon Counseling. But out of the office, I'm a mom, wife, daughter, sister, and friend. Join me each week as I sit with a special guest to discuss everyday things that impact our mental health. We'll be chatting about everything from mental health and relationships to media and current events, as well as personal experiences and reflections, all in the hopes of normalizing our humanness and helping you see that you're not alone. This is Outside the Therapy Room. Hi everyone, welcome to Outside the Therapy Room. Today we are joined by Jenni. Hi Jenni.
Hey Yvonne.
Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so this is your first time here, so would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jenni. I am the current MSW intern at New Moon Counseling. So yeah, that means I'm still in school, just finishing up my master's so that I can start working in the field as a clinical social worker or psychotherapist.
And you're completing your MSW at Laurier, and this is your last year. You'll be done in April.
Yes, I will.
That's exciting.
Yeah, I'm very excited.
I bet. Because this is Outside the Therapy Room, we ask all of our guests to share a little bit about yourself outside of the therapy space.
Yeah, sure. So I come to therapy in a very roundabout way. I used to be an ecological farmer. I used to live in intentional communities. I watched a lot of process pieces kind of go sideways with people trying to do really great things in the world. And it got me really curious about conflict. So as I started to dig into conflict, I started to learn more about how we as individuals approach each other relationally and the stuff that can get in the way that goes unexamined or unacknowledged, and then also how power interacts with that. So I got really curious about all these kind of dynamics, which led me into the world of therapy. And then I guess the other thing I'll say is that I'm a mom. That's like a huge part of who I am. And I try to stay involved with as much kind of community organizing or kind of mutual aid and care in my community as possible. That's really important to me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So there has been a lot that's been happening in the world lately that feels really heavy and overwhelming. And something that I've noticed both in and out of the therapy room is people asking, like, what do we do in these moments where things feel so uncertain or where there's so much divide in the world? How can we support all of these different areas in a way that feels good for us, but also in a way that's within our control? Because unfortunately, we are not so high in the, first line of power where we can, impact direct change right away. So in those moments, it can feel really discouraging and difficult to know kind of how to move along or how to support all of these different areas. So yeah, what is how has it been for you just with all of the world's issues that are currently going on around us? What are some things that you notice come up for you?
Well, it's been intense.
Yes.
I want to name first that the feelings of overwhelm or kind of more depression or anxiety make so much sense with the world that we're in right now. We are facing a lot of uncertainty, and I think as North Americans, we've often been kind of buffered or privileged from a lot of the uncertainty that the rest of the world has faced. And now we're kind of having it arrive at our door as well. So, that buffer's slowly slipping away, and we're being confronted with the uncertainty of the world. And a lot of us don't necessarily have the skills or the capacity yet to know how to deal with that.
Yeah.
And that can feel really overwhelming. So I think that first is just pause and acknowledge that the feelings are real. It is a big change that's happening right now, and we need to be kind to ourselves as a first step.
I think we're experiencing a lot of grief just with everything that's happening and the lack of control that we feel we have in those moments, but also just the grief of why is this happening right now?
Yeah, I know for me, as a cisgendered woman, I'm feeling the grief of watching all kinds of rights roll back, in the US and here, both for myself, but also for trans folks and for queer folks. And it's watching these policies come out does make me grieve a time where I felt like we were moving forward progressively, where I felt like I could have faith that we were choosing the kind route forward for each other. And so now that it seems like policies are being rolled back and what's being forefronted is not very kind, and it's quite hurtful and it's dangerous for a lot of people. So our grief also makes sense in context. Like, there is a lot at stake right now. There's a lot that we're losing. There's a lot of progress that's going backwards. So
Yeah.
It is a heavy time.
It is.
And sitting with the weight of it is very difficult. And I guess, like, the first thing I want to say is, like, we can't always sit with how heavy it is, and that's okay also. So if it's, not currently sitting in your lap, it's okay to take a bit of a breather so that you can regroup, so that you can show up to it again.
Exactly.
And sometimes that breather looks like laughing with your bestie, or like playing with your kids and turning off the news and just grounding out for a bit, because I think that that's really important in order for us to actually be able to show up and acknowledge what's really going on, is that we also do need to give ourselves a bit of a cognitive space sometimes to see what's right in front of us. And lots of us are still lucky enough to wake up and see the sun rise and be able to go outside and put our feet on the earth somewhere, or share a smile with a friend, and that those little things become really, really important when the big things start to feel like they're falling apart.
Well, it's also about our capacity, right? If we just sit in the dread of everything, that's not going to be beneficial for us or for the cause. And so being able to find those moments where we're able to take care of ourselves and set some of those boundaries and be present is going to give us more capacity to be, and like to have the energy and, emotional space to go and speak up for some of those things.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting because we don't want to put our heads in the sand right now. And there's a really big temptation to do that when things feel really overwhelming. And so, it's about finding that balance. It's taking care of ourselves, finding those small things that can ease our way forward. And I would encourage on that end to, like, do the things that help you feel grounded. I know grounding is a word that's thrown around a lot, but I think there's something really to acknowledging that when our nervous system is in a fight flight, we're not capable of creative thinking, and we're not capable of kind of like relationally working together in the most creative, productive way. We'll tend to be more reactive. So whether that's with folks that we're trying to do any kind of organizing with, or with our families, if we're in fight flight, we're not necessarily going to get where we need to go. And the times right now are really indicative of fight flight. So I think it calls on us to figure out what we need to do, whether that's like, I tend to go to grounding as a way to regulate my nervous system. So like going for a walk, or meditating, or visualization, or whatever. But those self-care pieces also become really important, and they almost become, they're not just about you. Like, I know for me, I always struggled with self-care because I tend to orientate towards the world, and like I want to be of service to the world. So trying to do self-care becomes tricky, because I'm like, well, what's the point? I don't necessarily want to do this bubble bath thing for me. But self-care in that context is actually building our capacity, like you said, so that we can show up more.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to know what grounding is. And I think you shared a lot of really great grounding exercises, like going for a mindful walk where you're actually able to feel your feet on the ground. You're able to pay attention to the noises around you. You're able to see the things that are around you, and really being able to use all of our senses in those moments when we're grounding or focusing on our breathing. It's anything that allows our body to pause and bring our thoughts back inward towards ourselves and our surrounding. And so those are some examples of grounding. But what can we do in those moments where we're wanting to be informed and at the same time are trying to create that space so that we have more capacity to be able to put things into action?
I really think that, like, I tend to think of things relationally. So grounding and paying attention to our own self-care is like one component, but in my mind, that's just one small part, because what we do together is a huge part of how we can answer this. And I'm going to get a little existential here, but I personally, and these are just my opinions, I personally see a lot of the chaos that we're looking at on a kind of a geopolitical scale as being perpetuated by this kind of hyper-individualism, where folks are out to get their best, to get their own. It's a hyperdrive capitalism that tends to cause stress and chaos and externalities, like people falling to the wayside that are having to bear the brunt of this, right? And so if that's what got us here, then something else has got to get us out of here. And so when I think of that, it is about so many teachings that exist around the world about how interconnected we are. So it's coming back to, feeling our own shape through grounding, feeling our shape when we're regulating our nervous system, but understanding that we're co-regulating beings. So how can we authentically and lovingly connect with and care for the people around us? And I see that as, concentric circles going out. That's our family, our kids, our partners, our best friends, our pets, right? Figuring out how to co-regulate, chill with them, but then also how do we invite a slightly bigger circle of that care? How do we show up and make sure that everyone's fed in our community, in our neighborhood, or our small circle of friends, or whatever that degree is? And then knowing that when we take care of them and they take care of us, that itself is a regulating and capacity building activity.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I think we've lost a bit of that in our trajectory in especially the last 50 years. And it's something that I think ideally we kind of return to considering is how do we deeply care for our community and make sure that, our neighbors fed too, not just us.
Yeah. And I think when you mentioned the regulation, there's co-regulation, and we can do that with people that we feel safe and comfortable with, and also when we come together as a community. And I think you're not wrong. There's been so much focus on codependence and that being a negative thing, when really as individuals that we thrive on connection. And so I agree with you. There's been a lot of focus on even on social media, and this could be a topic all on its own, but there's been such a focus on oh, are you codependent? That's negative. That's not good. And I think we need that as humans. I think we need to come together a little bit more now, especially in those times, in these times that are challenging, to be able to offer a space of safety and connection and laughter if there's the possibility to do that, or to cry together, whatever it is that we're needing, just being able to do that in a community.
Okay, first, I love that you just named that because, there is a very real thing about the nature of codependency that can be dysregulating and unhelpful.
Yes.
But that is so different than interdependence. And I think sometimes they get thrown out. And right now, I see a lot of people in my community who are struggling to exist in capitalism, who are struggling to have their own place or to buy their own groceries.
Yeah.
And I see them internalize shame and guilt about it because they don't want to be quote unquote dependent on someone else. Well, I am sorry, but for the vast history of humanity, we have been very dependent on each other.
Yeah.
And I think we've been sold a bit of a lie that we're supposed to be financially and materially completely independent, especially when we're existing in conditions right now that make that extremely difficult.
Yeah.
So, I'm trying, I want to bring back this, we are interdependent. It is okay to need each other, especially when it comes to these material things and regulating our nervous system. They all kind of go together. So if you can't make your rent, you need to ask your buds to help you out right now because the rental crisis is nuts.
Yeah.
Don't feel bad about it. Just do it because we need to create these networks of mutual aid and support. And that really is the way that we as people can gather some power to care for each other when the systems at large are not doing that care for us.
Yeah.
So there's no shame in it. But then the other thing I wanted to say when you were talking about wanting to cry together and things, I keep having this fantasy since the election of wanting to gather a bunch of people in a public park to just scream together.
Yes. Let's just be enraged together.
And scream, a good couple hours of screaming and crying and maybe some singing. Because, oh my God, I just think about how we're all sitting in our own little independent kitchens or living rooms or beds, feeling the weight of the world and not feeling connected. And that weight feels so much heavier when we can't share it with each other. And historically, cross-culturally, we had rituals of grief to share it together.
Yes.
And we have been divorced from that, especially the settler colonial culture. We don't know how to do that. We don't know how to process together anymore. And I think that sucks. And I think our body bears the brunt of that. And we feel it. Yeah.
And you've seen it so much on social media, people being like, things are feeling really heavy for me. I'm going to disconnect from social media. And that's wonderful. That's a great way to set those boundaries. But I hope that behind their phone or their social media that they are still connecting with other people, because it's great to have that. I mean, we just talked about this in the last episode, but with social media, there can be space for connection and there can be a lot of heaviness. And so in whatever way, I would love that park idea. I think that would be so great and healing for so many people. But sometimes we're not able to create that, but there may be a virtual space that we can do that together in a way that there's like-minded folks, and there's already an agreement of it being respectful, and this is the purpose of this community and this connection, so that it doesn't end up becoming something that's not positive or helpful.
Yeah, and I think that these things are happening in communities, and I think often they're happening in marginalized communities because folks tend to be more organized when they're forced to be organized. And so I can't recall any specific names of folks that are doing this or groups that are doing this, but I know it's happening where, even if we can't have this en masse like scream fest in the park, coming together with people that you trust to have even like a salon style conversation about like, hey, how are you feeling about this? And knowing that, that might be an offload of heaviness, but we're doing it so that we can feel connected and caring for each other. Maybe those conversations also involve like, what do you need right now?
Yeah.
And trusting that, I was saying with my friends, we always say everything's in the web. So it's like, whatever you need likely exists in the web of connections you have, and you won't necessarily reciprocate it exactly to that person, but it flows through and it all ends up balancing out. So don't be afraid to ask for what you need, offer what you can. I guess that's the principle of mutual aid too. But coming together and having that space to like offload the feelings and then try to move forward with how do we care for each other, I think is like a relational way to meet the moment that we're in right now.
Yeah. And so when we are wanting to take action, it can, like I said at the beginning, when things like this that feel so far out of our control happen, how can we feel in control, right? Like there's always a thing, like, pay attention to the things that you can control and not the things that we can't. So, now what can we do moving forward to still feel like we have some sense of control in our world?
Yeah, well, so our sense of agency is directly connected to our sense of well-being. Like knowing that we can take action in the areas that we need to or want to is directly tied to our sense of control in the world. And so when something happens like the election that can feel crushing. It's a crushing blow for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Finding the avenues and ways where we can enact agency, where we can act in some way, I think is imperative to our mental health. So it's like we've talked about what I'll name as kind of the micro level pieces, the like self-regulation parts. We've talked about kind of what I'll name as the meso, it's a middle ground community piece of coming together mutual aid. When we talk about the macro, the big system side, that's the hardest part to feel like we can gain power in. And as someone who's been involved in community activism, I would heavily encourage people to get organized. Look up groups that are working on the topics that are most important to you. Whether that's making sure folks in your community are fed or housed, or it's trans rights, or whatever it is. Make sure you look around, Google it, find folks that are working on it, and see how you can show up. If you want to volunteer somewhere, volunteer somewhere. If you want to show up to a rally, show up to a rally. And if you show up more than a few times, you'll start to make connections with people. You'll start to understand how it happens to organize. And it's like, as someone who's had a long history in organizing, most of the time we don't win what we're fighting for. But the process of taking action together, sometimes we do win. And that process of working together is in itself healing and allows us to enact agency. It means that I'm not sitting at home dreading what the next decision's being made on a high level that I have no power over. Because the fact is that we don't have power when we sit alone. But when we collect ourselves together and we get organized, we actually can access power. And so many of the positive changes that have happened that have been progressive in the past are because people have decided to get organized, to gather power and take action. So if you don't know where to start, like look at the community boards at the library, get online and search through Facebook for events, and just find something that aligns with what you're passionate about. Don't try to tackle everything, you'll burn out. But just
a little bit at a time.
Finding the thing that brings you joy, like whatever it is, on what level, what scale that you feel like you can connect to, and just take a small action in a small way. And I think that can really help.
And if folks can't go to rallies or volunteer their time, there are so many other ways that you can support a cause. So trying to find what would fit best for you, depending on what your needs or where your capacity is at. But there is that change that can happen even with these small choices that we make.
Absolutely. Like, I would encourage crafters. Like, I've had chronic health issues in the past, so I've been
Yeah.
stuck at home for long periods of time sometimes when I wanted to be out at the action or whatever.
Yeah.
But crafting something and selling it as a fundraiser for an organization that's doing something you care about is a great way to participate. Or giving it to a silent auction to support something, or making some food at home to drop off at an action, or Food Not Bombs. Like, there's lots of little ways to get involved with justice in your community.
Yeah.
Not all of it requires you to have money or a lot of time. Just
Yeah.
start somewhere. It can help.
Exactly. As we are going into the holiday season, or even not even, just having friends and people around us who may have a different opinion or a different voice, or, whatever, may share with you what their view is of things that are going on in the world currently. How can we handle those situations? Because if they're opposite than how we're feeling, it can be really tough to feel safe in that space that once felt safe for us. So again, just right now, because we're going into the holiday season, like, what are some things, or how can we navigate those conversations in a way that feels good for us?
This is a really good question, and it's super tricky because I think part of it's assessing where we're at, and part of it's assessing where they're at.
Yeah.
So in any given conversation, we need to assess, do I have the capacity to have this conversation? Because if I don't, it's not necessarily going to win anyone over to a more progressive view, and it might end up hurting us in the process, or whatever. Like, it's not necessarily going to have a positive outcome. So checking our own capacity, I think, is first. It's like,
Yes.
am I ready to engage in a conversation that might be tough? Is this a space that's conducive to me having that conversation? Or, honestly, I'll give space for, do I even care? Like, there's some space to be, if you want to head first into it, it might not always be productive, but I also understand that urge. But the other part, if we want to have a productive conversation, if we're hoping for some change to come out of it, I would also assess the other person's position and whether or not they're open to any other ideas, or if they're locked down in opposition. If they're locked down in opposition, you're likely not going to win them over anywhere. I mean, you could ask a couple curious questions to see if you can maybe poke some holes in logic, but otherwise I wouldn't necessarily waste the time on arguing with someone who's on the very opposite side of where I am, and especially if they're very stubborn about it. If they seem like they're open to some curious dialogue, then I would say approach folks, even with those ideas, as much as you possibly can, with some curiosity, and ask questions that help them question themselves.
Yeah.
And that can be a peaceful way to engage in that. But yeah, assessing the state of our nervous system, assessing the environment, assessing the state of their nervous system, I think are all parts about whether or not that's going to be a productive conversation that creates change, or if it's going to be an exercise in frustration.
Exactly. And I think that the main theme in that is checking in on your boundaries, right? It might be safer for us, or it might be part of us respecting our boundaries to choose not to say anything to a family member who is more stubborn and kind of locked into their views. Why should we then become so angry at them that then we are the ones that are put, like,
It's almost like we become responsible for...
Yeah, and then we're kind of fueled with this anger, but that person's totally fine and can continue on their day, right?
It's not really fair.
Yeah, it's not really fair. Like, why are we stuck feeling all of this? And so that can definitely happen at times. So it's just being able to assess those boundaries, and also connection to you, right? Like, it might be easier for me to have a conversation with my mom or close family members to educate them on certain matters, and there might be like able to receive it a little bit differently and more with that curious view than with somebody at the coffee shop that was standing behind me in line, right? Like, so it's trying to assess those connections and also ourselves. Like, are we in a good place to be able to have this conversation and leave here still feeling okay?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we get to choose whether or not we want to even engage.
Yes.
And sometimes the things that someone's saying are so hurtful directly to us or our close family members or community that it's not worth engaging.
Yeah.
And at the same time, if you want to blow up the family holiday dinner with your opinions because you feel passionately about it,
Yeah.
I personally understand. But yeah, checking in about your capacity. And I would say, folks that you are in deep relationship with too, we are also considering how we're maintaining that relationship, or whether or not we're maintaining that relationship, and what kind of care goes into it if we are.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of dynamics at play there. But
Yeah.
honoring your boundaries, honoring your capacity, reading the room. All good thoughts.
All good things. Yeah. The last thing I wanted to share is that there's been, a lot out there on therapy not being political or not being a political space. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that in the field of social work, politics and justice is part of our code of ethics. And that is something that the space for those conversations do exist in the social work field and even in the therapy room at times.
Yeah, I think it's crucial that we have these conversations. And there's somebody I follow on Instagram I'd highly recommend, called Decolonizing Therapy. I forget their name, it's Jennifer something, I think, but her work is profound on this topic. I do think it's crucial that as folks working in the field of mental health, for me personally, this is one of the things that I bring to it, is I'm constantly kind of looking at it through a lens of folks present with distress. Is that distress automatically categorized as a mental illness or a mental issue? Or is that distress due to systemic forces that have been really oppressive for a long time?
Yeah.
Because if you can't make your bills, if you can't ensure that you're going to feed your kids, that's going to cause anxiety and symptoms that look like depression. And I think classically, because we've lived in a neoliberal state, we've tend to look at the individual as the site of the issue, of the pathology. So when someone's showing up depressed and anxious because of their situation, we treat their mind as opposed to treat the system.
Yeah.
And you're right, like that's one of the differences of being social workers, is that we have a responsibility to not just look at the individual and what's going on for them, but look at their life, the ecology, the systems around them, and what political world we're living in right now, and how important it is that those systemic forces are impacting mental health. They're impacting health. They're huge indicators of health, or determinants of health. So it is our responsibility, I think, to consider the social political context of our clients showing up. And when we're working with folks, I think being sensitive and naming the systemic forces that may be impacting their mental health and helping clients to externalize that pain. To me, that's really important. It's like, hey, it's not your fault that you're struggling to make the rent. It's not your fault that you've endured microaggressions and racism for your whole life. The results of that in your body are not your fault. But we talk about what we can enact agency and control on, whether that's in our own bodies, in our own space, developing resiliency against those things, or whether it's, attending to the systemic forces that are causing those problems in the first place.
Yeah.
I often joke I'd love to have a therapy practice in the future that helps people get organized, because it's like, looking at the root of the problem often means addressing those systemic forces.
Yeah, and it's important for us to create that space in therapy to allow that to exist or to bring attention to it. I think there was a study, and if I find the study, I will try to put it in the show notes, but there was a study I read about, I think it was in my undergrad psych program, where they put garbage bins and not very nice things outside of an apartment. And the mental well-being of the residents in there it ended up going down because there were a lot more depression and anxiety because of the environment, of it looking unpleasing, of it smelling a certain way. And when they reviewed the folks that were living in a home and it was beautiful landscaping and there was beautiful flowers and trees around, their mental health was actually better. They didn't have as many reports of depression and anxiety, and they did feel a little bit more grounded and sound in that environment. And that speaks to the environment. Our environment has such a huge impact on our mental health. I don't think we pay as much attention to it as we should, but it does. And a lot of that comes in systemically, right? Like if we are in a space where it's not doesn't have as much funding, or it's not taken care of in a way that it should be, there is going to be more impacts on our mental health. And so being able to call on those things in in a therapy room is really important to understand overall the biopsychosocial of that client that's coming up and how their environment may be playing a role in it.
Yeah, totally. And I always want to also bring in the part where when we consider our environment, whether it's our upbringing, our family, our home, what we're surrounded by, our neighborhood, right? I also really want to also bring in this piece that's often, like you said, tied to the systems that we're living in. It's not our fault. And like, that's one of the reasons why I really appreciate narrative therapy too. So it's like looking at how we are kind of taught these meta narratives in society to fault ourselves, to fault our communities for our material conditions. And so we look at our environment and go, yeah, this sucks, so therefore my mental health sucks, but my community and me were the reason why this sucks. And I want to challenge that and push back on it and go, okay, what other narratives can we create here? There has been a history of racism. There's been a history of colonialism. There's been a history of extreme capitalism that has systemically oppressed many, many, many people. And so when we start to look at that structurally, we can start to externalize some of those narratives and go, hey, that's not mine. I didn't choose that story. I got told that story so that I'd be complicit in my place. And so when we start to externalize and say, that's not my story, what is my story? What is the story of my community? What is the resilience that we're living out? What is the struggle that we've endured for generations and we're still here trying to make something different happen? Then we can start to find our strength. And we start to find like, hey, even though we've lived in this environment that's not been great, like we're still raising our kids and we're still connecting as friends and family, and we still have a lot going on for us. So how can we then empower ourselves to start taking some action against that system? And yeah, so it's like therapy and action, they're all kind of interwoven for me too. Like I don't feel like I can separate them out.
We're encouraged to keep those two together from our college, right? And even what we learn in the field. Social work there's a macro lens and there's a micro lens, and it's important for us to be aware of both.
Yeah, that's why I chose the field. There's a lot of things in the field I'm not pleased with that need work. Just put that
we've
there.
Talked about,
We have lots of healing work to do in this field too.
Yes.
But yeah, it's the reason that we can the ability to address both our personal micro world and the macro systems together from a lens of justice is one of the reasons why I do love working in this field, and hope to continue to nudge it towards more of a, again, my opinion's not shared by others, but an abolitionist and very justice orientated principled way of working.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think it was such an important conversation for us to have at this time where things are feeling really unsettled, and I appreciate everything that you shared. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Yvonne. And I just want to offer up solidarity to everybody who's sitting in their kitchen right now wondering what to do. Like, I feel you. We're in it together, and let's find a way forward. Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye. Thank you for listening to Outside the Therapy Room. This podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you reside in Ontario and are interested in working with one of our therapists, please visit our website in the show notes. If you reside outside of Ontario, a quick Google search or search through Psychology Today will help you find a therapist near you.